Mount Everest is a place where dreams meet death. Every year, climbers from all over the world try to conquer its brutal heights, but not everyone comes back. Some are claimed by the icy slopes, their bodies forever frozen in time. One such climber was Frances Arsentiev, a woman whose story is as haunting as the nickname she was given, Sleeping Beauty. But the question remains, was an injustice done to her on Everest? In 1998, Frances Arsentiev set out to make history. She wanted to be the first American woman to summit Everest without using supplemental oxygen. It was a bold goal, one that only a few climbers dare to attempt. The climb was already dangerous, but doing it without extra oxygen made it even deadlier. Still, Frances was determined. Alongside her was her husband, Sergei, an experienced climber who supported her every step of the way. They ascended Everest with one focus: to reach the summit. But as they climbed higher into the thin air of the death zone, things began to go wrong. The lack of oxygen at that altitude messes with your mind. It makes you slow, confused, and even delusional. Frances started to struggle. But they were so close to standing on top of the world. After days of exhausting climbing, Frances and Sergei finally reached the summit. She had done it. She had made history. But in the deadly cold of Everest, celebrations are short. The real challenge was just beginning: the descent. As they made their way down, Frances's condition worsened. Her body was shutting down. She became disoriented, her movements erratic. Sergei tried to help, but time was running out. He made the difficult choice to leave her temporarily, hoping to find help. But on Everest, time moves differently. He never made it back. Frances was left alone on the mountain, freezing and helpless. Sergei disappeared shortly after, his body found days later at the base of a cliff, having fallen to his death while trying to save her. Frances Arsentiev became just another tragic figure claimed by Everest, until climbers started reporting seeing her body. She lay there, in her bright purple jacket, as if she were asleep. Her face frozen in a peaceful expression, untouched by the world around her. She became known as Sleeping Beauty, a nickname that seemed almost too gentle for such a horrifying end. For years, climbers passed by her body. They knew she was there, lying just below the summit, but nobody could do anything to help. Bringing a body down from that altitude is nearly impossible without risking your own life. And so, Frances remained, frozen in time, as climbers trekked past her on their way to their own summits. Some paused, taking a moment to acknowledge her, while others walked by without a glance, the fear of their own mortality too real to face. Was it fair to leave her there, alone on the mountain, as climbers after climbers passed her by? Some say it was the only choice. The death zone is called that for a reason. Every breath is a struggle. Every second counts. There's no time for sentiment when your life is on the line. But others argue that an injustice was done to her, that she deserved more than to be left as a frozen monument to the dangers of Everest. It wasn't until nearly a decade later, in 2007, that a group of climbers decided it was time to give Frances the dignity she had been denied. They set out on a mission to bring her body down, or at least move it to a less visible location. It wasn't just about removing her from the mountain, it was about honoring her as a person, not just another body lost to Everest. The climbers knew it would be a difficult task. As they approached her, they were struck by how peaceful she looked, lying there as if she were simply resting. But her presence was a constant reminder of the thin line between life and death on Everest. They carefully wrapped her body and began the dangerous descent. The mountain seemed to resist their efforts. The weather turned, the winds picked up, and avalanches rumbled in the distance. It was as if Everest itself didn't want to let her go, but they pressed on, determined to give Frances the dignity she deserved. After hours of painstaking effort, they finally reached a spot where they could lay her to rest, covered in snow, far from the main climbing route. It wasn't a grave, but it was the best they could offer. For the first time in nearly a decade, Sleeping Beauty was no longer on display for the world to see. But even after her body was moved, the question lingers: was an injustice done to her? In the harsh world of high-altitude climbing, every climber knows the risks. Frances Arsentiev knew the dangers of attempting to summit Everest without oxygen, but she chose to take that risk. Does that mean she deserved to be left alone on the mountain? her body exposed to the elements, her final moments unknown and terrifying? Some say that's just the nature of Everest. The mountain is ruthless, and it doesn't care about fairness or justice. Others believe that more could have been done for her, that leaving her there for so long was a stain on the ethics of the climbing community. Francis's son, Paul, who was just a boy when his mother died, grew up knowing that she lay frozen on the mountain. He had to live with the knowledge that his mother's body was still out there, on display for climbers to see, for photos to be taken. Imagine the weight of that, knowing your loved one's resting place is one of the most remote, inaccessible spots on Earth, and that nothing can be done to bring them home. Perhaps the real injustice is in how we, as a society, view these deaths on Everest. We are fascinated by the stories, drawn to the danger and tragedy. But do we forget that behind each of these bodies is a person, someone with dreams, fears, and loved ones left behind? Even though Francis Arsentiev's body was finally laid to rest, her story, her nickname, her tragic end, all remain part of Everest's dark history. Climbers still speak of her. Some say you can feel her presence near where she once lay, as if a part of her is still tied to the mountain. So, was an injustice done to Sleeping Beauty on Everest? Maybe the real question is whether any justice can exist in a place where nature rules and life and death hang by a thread. What do you think? Is it fair to chase a dream knowing it may cost you everything?